imagine the unease, like settling over Chicago in the 1940s, a city, still grappling with the aftermath of World War II.
Yeah.
And then two brutal murders, seemingly unconnected, shake the city to its core. And when a 6-year-old girl vanishes from her bed, the city plunges into absolute terror.
Oh, wow.
This is the story of the Lipstick Killer, a case so riddled with missteps and unsettling details that even decades later, it leaves us with more questions than answers.
Yeah.
So we're diving into the heart of this mystery, examining the murders of Josephine Ross, Frances Brown, and Suzanne Dignan.
These three victims on the surface seem to have nothing in common, yet their stories become tragically entwined in a whirlwind of media speculation, questionable police work, and a chilling confession.
It's a story that truly captures the dark underbelly of post-war America, revealing the anxieties and vulnerabilities of a nation trying to rebuild.
Right.
Let's start by transporting ourselves back to 1945 Chicago.
What?
The war may be over, but the echoes of conflict and loss still linger in the air. It's against this backdrop that 43-year-old Josephine Ross, a widowed mother of 2, becomes the first victim in this unsettling saga.
And her murder is particularly brutal.
Oh.
Josephine's apartment is ransacked, suggesting a possible robbery, but the level of violence goes far beyond a simple break-in. There's blood everywhere, and she's found in her bedroom, a skirt pulled over her head, and stockings tightly knotted around her neck.
Those details alone are chilling.
Yeah.
But what makes this case even more perplexing is the seeming contradiction in the crime scene.
Exactly. Despite the clear brutality, there are signs that the killer tried to clean up the scene.
What?
Investigators find bloody water and garments in the bathtub, almost as if they were trying to erase the evidence of their rage.
It's almost like a bizarre mix of fury and regret.
That's precisely what struck investigators. They discovered that Josephine's wounds, the slashes on her face and the stab wounds on her neck, had been meticulously covered with adhesive tape. It's as though the killer, in a moment of twisted remorse, attempted to undo the very violence they had inflicted.
This detail adds a layer of psychological complexity to the case, doesn't it? It suggests a level of personal turmoil within the killer, perhaps even a warped sense of guilt.
It does, and this brutality, coupled with the attempted cover-up, pointed investigators toward a possible personal connection between Josephine and her killer.
So who did the police initially suspect?
Well, Josephine was a social woman, active in her community, and had been seeing a few men. The police immediately zeroed in on 2 individuals, Oscar Nordmark, her fiancé, and Chester Rice, an ex-convict with whom she had a somewhat turbulent relationship.
It seems like the obvious place to start looking at the people closest to the victim.
Yes, but there was a major problem. Both men had solid alibis, corroborated by others.
Wow.
With no strong leads and no apparent motive, the investigation stalled and the case went cold. For 6 agonizing months, the city held its breath, wondering if the killer would strike again.
And then, tragically, they did. This is where the story takes an even darker turn, isn't it? The murder of Frances Brown and the emergence of the chilling moniker, the Lipstick Killer.
Precisely.
Yeah.
6 months after Josephine's murder, Frances Brown, also a widow, is found murdered in her apartment. The parallels to Josephine's case are startling. The ransacking, the deliberate positioning of the body, the washing, and again, the absence of any sexual assault. But this time, there's a chilling new element, a message scrawled on the wall in bright red lipstick. It reads, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself."
That's a message designed to instill fear,
Oh, yeah.
not only in the city, but in the very investigators tasked with catching this killer.
Absolutely. The lipstick message, coupled with the phrase, "for heaven's sake," initially led to a theory that the killer might be a woman.
Oh.
The police even looked into some romantic letters found in Frances's belongings that were written by a woman. But that theory quickly unraveled.
Because the level of brutality, especially the fact that Frances had been both shot and stabbed multiple times, didn't fit the profile of a female killer.
That, and there were those eyewitness accounts.
Right.
People reporting seeing a man leaving both Josephine's and Frances's buildings around the time of their murders.
I see.
But despite these leads and a smudged fingerprint lifted from Frances's apartment, the police couldn't make a match. The Lipstick Killer case was becoming a media sensation, and the city was on edge.
Yeah.
And then, just weeks later, the unimaginable happened. 6-year-old Suzanne Dignan vanished from her bed in the middle of the night.
This case, with its heartbreaking details and the sheer innocence of the victim, truly gripped the nation.
It did.
Yeah.
Imagine the terror that must have consumed Suzanne's parents when they discovered her empty bed and the window wide open. A ransom note demanding $20,000 was found, and Suzanne's father made a desperate plea for her safe return on the radio.
Wow.
But it was all in vain. Later that day, her severed head was discovered in a sewer.
That detail is just horrific. The brutality of the crime and the fact that her body was dismembered and scattered throughout the city shocked everyone.
It was a level of depravity that no one could have anticipated.
Yeah.
And under the immense pressure to solve this case, the police made some egregious missteps.
Oh.
Their focus quickly shifted to Hector Verberg, the superintendent of the building where Suzanne lived.
Because they believed Suzanne had been murdered in the building's basement.
Yes. The investigators found what they thought was a murder room in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
There were bloodstains, a bloody pushcart, and a locker containing a hacksaw.
Mm-hmm.
Because Hector had access to the basement, he immediately became their prime suspect.
But wasn't Hector well regarded in the neighborhood? I mean, he didn't seem to fit the profile of a brutal killer.
You're right.
Okay.
He was known as a kind and helpful man, even something of a local hero.
Wow.
He fixed up toys for children in need and had a good reputation. He also had a solid alibi supported by his wife, but none of that mattered to the police, who were desperate for a break in the case.
So they resorted to unthinkable tactics to extract a confession from him.
They did. What happened to Hector Verberg is a dark stain on this already grim story.
Huh?
He was subjected to brutal torture hung by his handcuffed wrists until his toes barely touched the floor, beaten and deprived of food and water.
That's awful.
The physical and psychological trauma he endured was unimaginable.
It's a stark reminder of how easily the pursuit of justice can be twisted into something monstrous. What happened to Hector after this ordeal?
He was hospitalized and suffered permanent disabilities as a result of the torture inflicted upon him.
Oh my gosh.
He was eventually awarded a $20,000 settlement for the abuse he suffered at the hands of the police. But no amount of money could truly compensate for the trauma he endured.
It's a truly appalling chapter in this story.
Yeah.
One that raises serious questions about the methods employed by the police.
Right.
But if they realized Hector wasn't their guy, where did they turn next?
Well, they finally decided to follow up on that confession from the Arizona man, Richard Thomas, who had admitted to killing Suzanne. But by that point, they had already settled on another suspect, William Hirons.
Wait, so they had a confession with specific details about the crime, even mirroring the ransom note, and they simply dismissed it.
It seems that way. The Chicago police had a theory, and they were determined to make it fit, even if it meant ignoring potentially crucial evidence.
This is where William Hirons enters the story, a troubled 17-year-old with a history of petty theft. What led them to him?
He was arrested for prowling around the time of Suzanne's murder, so he was already on their radar, but only for minor offenses.
Okay.
And here's where things get even more disturbing. It wasn't even the police who initially connected Hirons to the Degnan case.
If it wasn't the police, who was it?
A reporter for the Chicago Tribune suggested comparing Hirons' fingerprints to those found at the crime scene.
So a reporter, not the police, made the connection that would define this entire case.
That's right. And what's even more unsettling is that the police, who had previously declared the fingerprints from the ransom note incomplete and impossible to classify, suddenly announced a match. Within minutes of this suggestion. It's almost as if they were looking for any excuse to close this high-profile case.
That certainly raises questions about their objectivity and their willingness to manipulate evidence.
It does.
Uh-huh.
And then, to solidify their theory, they discovered surgical tools in Hirons' dorm room.
Okay.
Suddenly, they were presenting him to the public as some sort of surgical mastermind capable of dismembering a body with precision.
But he was just a teenager with no medical training? How did they reconcile that?
They didn't. They simply allowed the media to run wild with the narrative. Fabricated stories about Hirons confessing to the murders were published, and the public quickly turned against him. It was a full-blown media circus, and a 17-year-old boy was caught in the center of it.
It's a classic case of trial by media,
Right.
where public opinion is swayed before the facts even have a chance to emerge.
Yeah.
What happened to Hirons once he was in custody?
He was subjected to intense pressure, threats, and even injections of sodium pentothal, what was often referred to as truth serum at the time.
But we know that truth serum is highly unreliable, and its use is ethically questionable, right?
Absolutely.
You okay?
It's considered a form of coercion and is often illegal. And what's worse is that Hiron's parents weren't even notified about what was happening to their son.
Jeez.
They were completely shut out of the process.
It's a blatant disregard for due process and basic human rights. So under this intense pressure, did Hirons confess?
They offered him a deal. Confess to all 3 murders, avoid the death penalty, and serve a life sentence for burglary.
That deal itself is incredibly suspect. Why offer it if they had a strong case against him?
It's a question that continues to haunt this case. It suggests a lack of confidence in their evidence. And you have to remember, this was a 17-year-old boy, isolated, scared, and facing a potential death sentence. He initially refused to confess, but after the fabricated confession was published in the newspaper, he simply broke.
He must have felt completely trapped, knowing that the public already believed he was guilty and that there was no way to fight back against this tidal wave of accusations.
Exactly. His coerced and unreliable confession became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, even though it was riddled with inconsistencies and lacked any real connection to the murders of Josephine Ross and Frances Brown.
So how did the trial unfold with such a questionable confession at its center?
The trial was, to put it bluntly, a spectacle. The prosecution leaned heavily on the confession, despite its inconsistencies, and presented very little tangible evidence that actually linked Hirons to any of the murders. They did, however, make sure to emphasize that seemingly irrefutable fingerprint evidence.
But didn't you say earlier that experts later debunked that fingerprint analysis?
That's right. Years later, experts would prove that the so-called 9-point match they used to convict Hirons was flawed.
Really?
That type of match, based on the limited fingerprint technology of the time, could have matched 65% of the population. Not exactly a slam dunk for the prosecution.
That's shocking. So the very evidence that sent William Hirons to prison for life was basically meaningless.
Exactly. And there's more. Remember that smudged fingerprint from Frances Brown's apartment?
Yeah.
Well, it turned out to be what's called a rolled print, the kind taken for police records. That kind of print wouldn't naturally occur at a crime scene.
Are you suggesting someone planted that fingerprint to frame Hirons?
It certainly seems that way. Someone went to great lengths to ensure that William Hirons took the fall for these crimes. It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of questions about the integrity of the entire investigation.
It's almost as if they were so focused on getting a conviction, they didn't care who they sacrificed in the process. But if Hirons didn't commit these murders, what happened to Josephine Ross and Frances Brown? Did the police ever seriously investigate any other leads?
That's the most disturbing part of this whole story.
Yeah.
The framing of William Hirons not only robbed him of his life, but allowed the person or persons actually responsible for those 2 murders to escape justice.
So 2, maybe even 3, murderers were walking free while an innocent teenager spent his life behind bars for crimes he didn't commit.
Exactly. And those initial details in Josephine Ross's case,
Right.
the overkill, the washing, the taping of the wounds, all those elements pointed to a personal connection, a deep-seated rage.
And don't forget, nothing was stolen in either case.
Right.
It does seem like the killer knew the victims.
You're absolutely right. But if it wasn't Oscar Nordmark or Chester Rice, who could it have been? And is there any actual connection between those murders and the horrific killing of Suzanne Degnan? Officially, the Chicago police still maintain that all 3 cases are connected and that William Hirons was responsible.
But we've seen how flawed that conclusion is.
Yeah.
It seems like a convenient way to tie up loose ends and avoid admitting they made a catastrophic mistake.
I agree. The evidence just doesn't add up. The handwriting analysis from the ransom note, the fingerprint discrepancies, the vastly different modus operandi in each case, all of it points to the possibility of at least 2, if not 3, separate killers operating during that time.
This leaves us in a really unsettling place.
Yeah.
3 brutal murders, a web of inconsistencies, and a deeply flawed investigation that led to the wrongful conviction of a teenager.
And what's even more disturbing is that this case isn't just about the lipstick killer.
Right.
It's about a system that failed on every level. The Chicago Police Department, under intense pressure, succumbed to tunnel vision, zeroing in on Hirons and ignoring any evidence that didn't fit their narrative. The media, hungry for a sensational story, amplified those mistakes,
Yeah.
turning a 17-year-old boy into a monster in the public's eyes. And the justice system itself, with its reliance on plea bargains and its disregard for due process, ultimately rubber-stamped a wrongful conviction.
It's a chilling reminder that the pursuit of justice can be corrupted by ambition, fear, and a desperate need for closure. It makes you wonder how many other William Hirenses are out there, victims of a system that prioritizes a quick resolution over the truth.
That's the question that haunts this case, and it's one we need to grapple with. The lipstick killer story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that we can't simply accept the official narrative,
Right.
especially when the evidence points in a different direction.
The media's role in this whole affair is particularly troubling.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like they were complicit in creating a climate of fear and suspicion that ultimately contributed to Hiren's conviction.
You're right. The way they portrayed Hirons, the fabricated confessions, the sensationalized headlines, they all played a part in swaying public opinion and turning him into a scapegoat. It highlights the importance of being critical consumers of media, especially when it comes to high-profile cases like this.
We all have a responsibility to question what we read and hear, to look for evidence, and to demand accountability from those in power. But going back to the unsolved murders of Josephine Ross and Frances Brown, do you think there's any hope of ever finding the real killer or killers?
It's difficult to say. So much time has passed, and the trail has gone cold. But with advances in DNA technology and forensic science, there's always a possibility that new evidence could emerge.
Maybe one day those families will finally get the answers they deserve. But for now, we're left with this unsettling feeling that justice has been denied. William Hirons, a young man robbed of his life, and two other victims whose stories have been overshadowed by the focus on the wrong suspect.
The lipstick killer case is a stark reminder that our justice system is not infallible. It's a system made up of human beings, prone to errors, biases, and sometimes even malicious intent. We can't simply assume that the police always get it right or that the courts always deliver true justice.
We need to be vigilant, to hold those in power accountable, and to demand a system that prioritizes truth and fairness above all else.
Exactly. And that's why cases like this are so important to revisit, to examine the evidence, to question the official narrative, and to make sure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated.
It's a sobering reminder that even in a society that prides itself on justice, the truth can sometimes be elusive, and the innocent can be unjustly punished. But by continuing to talk about these cases, by raising awareness, and by demanding better from our systems, we can hopefully prevent tragedies like this from happening again. It's a heavy truth to confront, that the very systems meant to protect us can sometimes fail so spectacularly. And in the lipstick killer case, that failure had devastating consequences, leaving us with a tangled web of unanswered questions and a profound sense of injustice.
It's a case that challenges our faith in law enforcement, in the media, and even in our ability to discern truth from fiction. We started this deep dive wanting to understand the lipstick killer, but we've uncovered something far more disturbing, a story of ambition, desperation, and a willingness to sacrifice an innocent life for the sake of expediency.
The case of William Hirons is truly heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is.
He was essentially robbed of his entire life, labeled a monster, and forgotten by the very system that was supposed to uphold justice. And as we discussed, his wrongful conviction allowed the real killer, or killers, in the cases of Josephine Ross and Frances Brown, to disappear into the shadows.
Right.
It's almost as if their stories were erased, deemed less important than the narrative the police and the media had already constructed.
And that's one of the most troubling aspects of this whole saga. The focus on Hirons, fueled by the media frenzy and the police's desire for a quick resolution, completely overshadowed the search for the truth in those other cases.
Right.
It raises the question, were those murders ever truly investigated with the same intensity and rigor, or were they simply swept under the rug once Hirons became the convenient scapegoat?
It's unsettling to think that those families may never get the answers they deserve.
It really is.
That their loved ones' cases were essentially sacrificed to appease public fear and maintain the illusion of a solved case.
It's a stark reminder that justice is not always evenly distributed. Sometimes the pursuit of a high-profile conviction, especially in a case that has gripped the public's imagination, can overshadow the need for a thorough and impartial investigation. And when that happens, it's often the most vulnerable who pay the price.
In this case, it was William Hirons, a young man with a troubled past who was easily molded into the monster the public craved.
Right.
And the real perpetrators, perhaps emboldened by their success in evading capture, were free to continue their lives, their crimes, forever shrouded in mystery.
The lipstick killer case, despite its official closure, remains an open wound. A reminder of the fragility of our justice system and the human cost of its failures. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own biases,
Right.
our susceptibility to sensationalism, and our willingness to accept simple narratives, even when the evidence suggests something far more complex.
This deep dive has been a journey into the darkness, a descent into the heart of a city gripped by fear and a system that lost its way. It's left us with more questions than answers, a profound sense of unease, and a renewed commitment to seeking truth, even in the most unsettling of circumstances.
And that's the most valuable takeaway from this exploration.
Mm.
The lipstick killer case is not just a historical curiosity, it's a living testament to the importance of critical thinking, of questioning authority, and of never giving up on the pursuit of justice, no matter how elusive it may seem.
We may never know the full truth about the lipstick killer or the identities of those responsible for the murders of Josephine Ross and Frances Brown. But we can honor their memory by refusing to let their stories be forgotten,
Right.
by continuing to ask questions, and by demanding better from the systems that are meant to protect us all.
We encourage you to delve deeper into this case, to explore the sources we've provided, and to form your own conclusions. Was William Hirons truly innocent? Are the Ross and Brown murders connected to the Degnan case? What other theories might explain these brutal crimes? Share your insights, and let's continue this conversation. The pursuit of justice demands our constant vigilance and our unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth.